Can we continue? Before we move on to chapter 2, are there any questions on what we covered in the first chapter? Any questions from what we covered in the first chapter? Are there any questions from chapter 1? All right. Moving on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is part of topic 1, and we're looking at the introduction. And under chapter 2, they ask us to look at the essentials of credit risk analysis. And under this chapter, on section 2.1, they look at the meaning of credit risk. And here they say, from the beginning of the paragraph, they say, credit risk can be defined as follows. Credit risk refers to the probability of the loss emanating from the credit extended as a result of non-fulfillment of contractual obligations arising from unwillingness or inability of the counterparty or for any other reason. So if the probability of the loss is high, the credit risk involved is also high and vice versa. So which basically means that the driver for credit risk is basically the probability of default of the obligor in this case. So the obligor, when you talk about the obligor, we're talking about the borrower. So please take note of the terminology that is also used as well. So whenever they refer to the obligor, they are also referring to the borrower in that case as well. So in this case, they are basically saying that when it comes to credit risk can be divided into two. We can look at credit risk from a single borrower or which is the firm or the obligor credit risk, or we can look at credit risk from a portfolio credit risk, where we're now looking at the combination of two or more borrowers in this case. So the combination of two or more obligors, we consider that to be a portfolio of credit risk level. So the weighted risk of that is emanating from a combination of two or more borrowers, we refer to it as what? Portfolio credit risk. So on section 2.2, we look at causes of credit risk. And here they say, credit risk is subtle and hidden and has to be unearthed carefully, especially in the view of the fact the returns for credit risk are much lower than other kinds of investments, such as equity or real estate. So in fact, credit risk is the product of a variety of events, some controllable and others uncontrollable as well. So when we look at credit risk, we're basically saying that when we look at the major causes of credit risk, the major causes of credit risk can be systematic risk or unsystematic risk. So when we look at systematic risk can be, this is basically the risks that are not within the control of the organization. So the risks that are not within the control of the organization can be caused by social political risks, economic risks, or any other exogenous risks as well. So when they talk about exogenous risk, this is basically risks coming from outside the economic control of the organization as well. Then there's also unsystematic risk, and unsystematic risk can be business risks and also financial risks. When we look at business risk, this is basically risk coming from the income generating activities of the business. And then financial risk is basically that risk that is coming from what? Financing of the business as well, the financial preparation of financial operations of what? Of the organization. But we're going to look at it in detail in the chapters to follow, especially when it comes to business risks and financial risks as well. So looking at systematic and unsystematic risk, I'll need to explain it a little bit further as well. So we know that the total risk faced by an organization is given as your systematic risk plus unsystematic risk. So remember we said your systematic risk is the uncontrollable risk that is being faced by the organization. And then the unsystematic risk is basically that risk that is what that is within the control of the organization as well. So which means another terminology, the systematic risk, we also refer to it as non-diversifiable risk. And the unsystematic risk, we also refer to it as the diversifiable risks as well. So we refer to these as diversifiable risk as well. Now, when it comes to the risk measures, we see that the total risk faced by an organization, typically it's measured by standard deviation. So the total risk of the organization is measured by standard deviation. And then the systematic risk faced by the organization is measured by the beta, where we look at the beta being measured as the change in the return of the asset divided by the change in the return of the market as well. So this is basically how you measure the beta as well. So when you look at it diagrammatically as well, that's why you see that when you look at the relationship between these different risks as well, we can also present it diagrammatically as something like this, where we say this amount of risk, where we look at the total risk of the organization, and then we also look at the number of different securities. And we said the more the number of different securities you have in your portfolio, the more this risk falls away. And what is this risk? This risk is the diversifiable risk. So the more you diversify your portfolio, by having different securities in your portfolio, the more this diversifiable risk falls away. So this diversifiable risk can fall away until we are only left with this risk. So this risk is basically what we refer to as systematic risk. So which means the total risk of a portfolio can reduce to such an extent that you're only left with systematic risk. So which basically means that when your portfolio is fully diversified, this diversifiable risk is going to be zero, which means your total risk is going to be represented by the beta. That's why you see that later on, when we look at concepts such as the capital asset pricing model, with the capital asset pricing model, we assume that to determine your expected return, the only risk we're going to be assuming is the beta, or take into account is the beta, mainly because we're basically saying that we're assuming that the portfolio is fully diversified. And when the portfolio is fully diversified, the only risk measure that is going to be relevant to you is the beta, which means that the capital asset pricing model assumes that the only risk measure that is relevant to you is going to be the beta as well. So please take note of the overall breakdown of what makes up your total risk, which is your systematic risk and your unsystematic risk as well. Are there any questions? Any questions? Anyone else?
Can you explain beta? Can you explain beta again? BETA. Can you explain that again?
What it is. So beta, basically, in simple terms, beta measures systematic risk. So which means that with beta, we're basically saying that when your portfolio is fully diversified, we're saying when your portfolio is fully diversified, your unsystematic risk is going to be zero, which means that your total risk is going to be your beta. So your total risk is going to be measured by your beta when your portfolio is fully diversified. And the reason why we would be very much interested in beta is later on in the chapters, you will see that when it comes to your credit portfolio, you will need to diversify your credit portfolio because there is no incentive for you to not diversify your portfolio. Mainly because, remember, you are getting a single amount of return. Like, for example, if you give someone money, they promise you 10% return. So there's no incentive for you to take on more risk. The only risk they should be willing to take is the amount of risk that you initially took as well. So because of this, it basically means that when your portfolio is fully diversified, the only risk you're assuming to be taking in this case is going to be measured by beta, which is your systematic risk. So when your portfolio is fully diversified, the risk that you're going to be taking in this case is going to be a systematic risk. How we calculate the beta for credit risk management, calculation of the beta, you don't have to worry about it. But for market risk, when we talk about beta, you will see that I'll also show you the calculation of the beta as well. But from credit risk management as well, you don't have to worry about the calculation of the beta. You just need to know that the idea of your credit portfolio is that you need to diversify your portfolio risk to such an extent that your diversifiable risk falls away and you're going to be left with what? Systematic risk. And how do you measure this systematic risk? Your systematic risk is measured by beta. So your incentive is to ensure that your credit risk portfolio, your credit portfolio is fully diversified such that you only having exposure to systematic risk, which is measured by beta, which means that you are now going to be saying if your portfolio is fully diversified, the only thing that you have to worry about mitigating would be your systematic risk. That's why they are introducing you to this distinction between systematic and unsystematic risk. Are there any questions? Any questions? Moving on. So when it comes to the systematic risk, remember we said that your systematic risk can be coming from your socio-political risks, your economic risks, and other exogenous risks as well. Then your unsystematic risk can be emanating from business risk and financial risks as well. Section 2.3, we also look at credit risk and return. And here they say, I'll read from the beginning of the paragraph. And here they say, the primary objective of a business firm taking credit risk is to earn a return. So while the financial intermediary earns commission or interest income, non-financial firms benefit in the form of enhanced sales, resulting in more profits. So economic agents involved with credit risk will attempt to maximize return for a given level of risk and minimize the credit risk for a given level of return. So when you look at the credit risk and return relationship, it's coming from this analysis where we look at the relationship between risk and return. Where, for example, they can give you a scenario and say, if you are given investment A and investment B, and then they say, which of the two investments would you choose? So which of the two investments would you choose to invest in? Yeah. So which of the two investments would you choose to invest in? Investment A or investment B, and why? So if you're given a choice between investment A and B, which of the two investments would you choose to invest in? Would you choose to invest in investment B, or would you choose to invest in investment A, and why would you do that? So which of the two investments would you choose in this case?
Can you please zoom in your graph?
Which device are you using?
It's a phone.
Or maybe that's why the screen is a bit smaller. because I'm checking how it would look on a laptop as well. Okay, maybe it would be a bit more clearer. Let's say, for example, your risk is 1, and your beta, your return for asset A would be 10%, and your return for asset B would be 8%. So for a risk of 1, for a risk exposure of 1 unit, they tell you that for asset A, you earn a return of 8%, and for asset B, you earn a return of 10%. So which of the two investments would you choose?
B.
Why?
Because for the same risk of 1, I will get a return of 10.
Yes. So which means this is why that statement is very, very important. If you go back to that statement that they give us here, they say you want to minimize, you want to be able to maximize the return for a given level of credit risk. So for a given level of credit risk, in this case, you want to ensure that you are able to maximize your return by choosing investment B than investment what? Investment A as well. And then let's say, for example, we are also given a comparison where they ask us to compare investment. They ask us to compare investment, B and investment C. And they tell us that for investment C, your credit risk exposure is 1.2, and your return is equals to 10%. So which of the two investments would you choose between investment B and investment C, and why?
I think I will still go with option B. The reason being is that the amount which I'm going to spend to manage the risk is still low compared to the returns that I'm going to get.
Yes. So which means you choose investment B, reason being for the same amount of return, you are exposing yourself to what? To lesser risk, isn't it? So for the same amount of return, you're exposing yourself to lesser risk. So this is why that statement which says you want to be able to minimize your credit risk for a given level of return, which means that you want to be able to minimize your credit risk for a given level of what? Of return. So which means please make sure that you take note of that statement. It's a very, very important statement. Reason being, overall, you are saying that when you look at the relationship between risk and return, you want to be able to maximize your return for a given level of risk. And at the same time, you want to be able to minimize your risk for a given level of what? Of return as well. So please make sure that you take note of that. So when it comes to the relationship there between risk and return, you need to be able to, your aim is to be able to achieve that goal of maximizing your return for a given level of risk, and at the same time, being able to minimize your risk for a given level of return as well. Are there any questions before we move on to section 2.4? Any questions? Moving on to 2.4, they look at credit risk analysis. And under this section, they say, credit risk analysis is the study of the perspective, from the perspective of the supplier of credit, of a present or prospective claim on another economic agent in the form of debt, including trade payables, loans, public securities, amongst others. So when you look at credit risk analysis, they look at credit risk analysis from the bank's perspective of financial institutions as well. And when you look at it from a bank's perspective of financial institutions, they say, from a bank or financial institution, they say, what are the risks involved in extending a loan to a particular firm? So given the risk level, how should it be priced? What about the repayment capability? Is the management capable? Which economic or industrial factors will impact the performance of the firm. So that's basically, from the bank's perspective, the credit risk analysis is basically involving answering those questions of the potential obligor as well. Then when you look at it from a mutual fund or insurance company's perspective, they say the question would be, shall we invest in debentures or bonds of XYZ Limited? What about the financial position and major solvency ratios? Are the indenture provisions adequate? What are the major factors that may trigger distress and default on the debt? So given the risk level, is the return acceptable as well? So those are some of the questions that mutual funds or insurance companies would need to address before they extend credit as well. Then manufacturer or trader, the question that they need to address is, should we extend credit to the customer? And if so, what is the credit period to be offered? So what are the financial position and bank facilities enjoyed by the customer? And is collection risk also manageable as well? So those are some of the questions that the supplier of goods and services can also would be asking as well before they supply these goods and services to the customer as well. Then when you look at hedge funds, the questions would be, shall we buy distressed debt of XYZ Limited? Will the final recovery of the claims be higher than the current prices? And what is the downside to buying the distressed debt or claims at current prices? Are the returns attractive? And if they are, that's when they can consider what? Investing in such securities as well. And so these are some of the strategies that hedge funds can also pursue, where they look at a strategy of what? Investing in distressed securities, where they're looking to buy distressed securities. Sometimes they even go as far as having a majority ownership in a distressed security, so that they put in place a turnaround strategy and recover the distressed investment as well. Like, for example, if it's a distressed company, they buy majority ownership in the distressed company, they come up with a turnaround strategy. Remember, when they buy the distressed security, because everyone else is selling their security, the price is basically usually undervalued. Then when they buy and implement a turnaround strategy as well, and then eventually when the company is not doing well, they sell off that company, they will be able to what? They would have actually made a lot of money, because remember, when the company is not doing well, the share price would have what? Would have recovered as well. So those are some of the hedge fund strategies that they can also implement as well. And for them to be able to do that, they need to take into account, they need to ask these questions on whether they should take these investments into these distressed securities as well. Then they also say, besides suppliers of credit, there are other parties who have a general interest in the creditworthiness of an economic agent. And these other economic players would be a potential customer or buyer, auditors, or even borrowers as well. So just take note of them. Are there any questions on what we covered in section 2.4? Any questions? Section 2.5 looks at the historical progress of credit risk analysis. So on your own time, you can go through the historical progress of credit risk analysis, but I don't see the relevance of how they would bring such questions in the exam. So because I don't see the relevance of how they would bring such a question in the exam as well, I don't think that is something that we need to worry about when it comes to preparation for the exam. But you need to know it, so that in from application perspective in the workspace, you need to be able to know the historical progress of what? Credit risk analysis as well. So you can just go over it on your own time. Then the next section, which is section 2.6, looks at the need for credit risk analysis. And so the reason why we need to do credit risk analysis would be because the first one is due to prudence. And yet the same, demand for credit is pervasive, given the insatiable desires constrained by limited resources. And credit is one of the techniques adopted to overcome this problem. However, It is the responsibility of the supplier of credit to ensure that their actions are prudent, because excessive credit will prove disadvantageous to almost everyone in the economy as well, because the excessive availability of credit in the economy basically means that people are just going to be borrowing money and not efficiently using that money as well. Like what I said, where you're borrowing money to buy things that are not necessarily going to be creating economic value, are not going to be able to create economic value. So which means that there is going to be the lesser the efficient of use of the funds available as well, the lesser the performance of the economy as a whole as well. Then, so it basically means that there is need for prudent analysis. The reason why we need to do credit risk analysis mainly because we need to be able to be prudent as well. So here they say, the only alternative left is to conduct a proper risk analysis of the credit, ascertain, measure, and manage the credit risk in such a manner that it does not spin out of control. Then the second one is increase in bankruptcies. And if we read from the beginning of the paragraph there, they say recessionary phases are common for the economy, although timing and causes may be different for different countries. So ample examples exist from history. So during a recession, bankruptcies multiply. So the reason why we need to do credit risk analysis is mainly because we see that remember we say that the economy moves in different cycles. So the economy moves in different cycles where over the years, the economic performance over time, they're basically saying the economy moves in different cycles like this, where here the economy is experiencing trough, and here the economy is experiencing a peak, and this is where the economy is expanding. So this is having an expansionary phase, and this is the point where the economy is having a contractionary phase. And remember, during the contraction phase, this is basically where we look at the recession as well, right? So because the economy moves during these different phases as well, we also see that when it comes to credit risk at the same time, we see that the credit risk is generally higher. So the credit risk is generally higher during this phase. So during this phase, this is where we see that bankruptcies are increasing. So which also means that credit risk during this period there is also expected to be increasing as well. And then during this period there, credit risk is expected to be going down, mainly because bankruptcies are going down, mainly because during this phase, there's growth in demand for goods and services. And because there's growth in the demand for goods and services, so they're expecting firms to be doing well during the expansionary phase. And if firms are doing well during the expansionary phase, it also means that you would expect bankruptcies to be lower as well. But when you go through this phase there, the demand for the goods and services is expected to contract. And as the demand for goods and services is expected to contract as well, it basically means that there is going to be an increase in bankruptcies as well. So which basically means that because of this, it means that the reason why we need to do a good credit risk analysis as well is mainly because the moment we see that we're going through this phase, automatically it means the financial firm should also expect an increase in what? Bankruptcies generally within the economy. And when they will go through this particular phase as well, we should expect the opposite of that to be true. The other reason why credit risk analysis is important is due to increase in competition. And the other thing, with increase in competition, naturally, pricing is under pressure. So when margins get thinner, even the previously accepted level of bad debts would become unacceptable as well. So which means when there's an increase in competition, it means that your profit margins are expected to decline, mainly because increase in competition, it means that the firm is expected to, expect that at some point the firm is going to be forced to lower its price. If they were selling a good at 100 Rand, they might be forced to lower their price to, let's say, 80 Rand. So if they lower their price to 80 Rand, it basically means that their profit margins are expected to increase when competition increases as well. So what does that mean? It means that if the profit margins go down, it means that the company now needs to ensure that they keep a very tight handle on their expenses. And one of their expenses that they need to make sure that they keep a very tight handle on is basically the bad debts as well. So which basically means that in this case, it basically means that if a 5% bad debt was previously acceptable before there was an increase in competition, it basically means that we might have a situation where we now need to make sure that we keep a very tight hold on our bad debts, which is basically an expense, by trying to reduce the amount of bad debts as well from 5% to a lower level, so that we're able to have a sustainable profit margin as much as possible as well. So which means the credit risk analysis is very, very important, especially during periods where there's an increase in competition as well. Are there any questions so far? Any questions? The fourth reason is the issue of volatility of collateral or assets values. And here they say, gone are the days when collateral offered comfort. So while it is no longer easy to insist on collateral, in view of the increasing competition in the market, the value of collateral also fluctuates widely, especially where you are using financial assets as collateral. Because when you look at use of financial assets as collateral as well, you'll see that financial assets like shares, if they're going to be used as collateral as well, it basically means that the value of the collateral that is being used is very much dependent on the performance of a third-party company as well that they've invested in. So which means that in that case, it basically means that when the third-party company does not, third-party company that has been, that the borrower has invested in does not perform very well, what is going to happen? It basically means that the value of the shares that are being used as collateral is going to go up, is going to go down. And when the value of the shares that are used as collateral goes down, it also means that the risk exposure of the supply of credit is also going to end up increasing in that case. Now, the next reason for credit risk analysis is poor asset quality. And here they say non-performing assets. Non-performing asset is the term used to denote credit assets that are on the verge of becoming credit losses as well. So which means for financial institutions as well, they need to make sure that they are able, for them to be able to keep a very tight look on the, when it comes to monitoring and reviewing of credit assets as well. It basically means that they need to be able to make sure that they're able to see and identify poor asset quality or poor performing assets as soon as possible, so that they're also able to make that decision to say, should we let go of these assets, or should we still expect maybe there's going to be a recovery of those assets as well. And the only way that the company organization or the supplier of credit is going to be able to do that is when they do regular credit risk analysis as well. The next reason for credit risk analysis is high impact of credit losses. And I'll read from the beginning of the paragraph there. And here they say, it is a common perception that a small percentage of bad debt is acceptable and won't do much damage. However, unfortunately, it is not the case. Even a small credit facility will hurt the business if it turns bad, especially for banks and other financial intermediaries operating in a highly competitive sector. Reason being, even if it's a small credit facility that has resulted in a loss as well, what do we see? banks, because of their limitations of exactly where they can invest in, that's why you see that many banks are always trying to lobby for deregulation. That's why even if you look at the case of Silicon Valley Bank as well, it's one of the banks that was trying to, as much as possible to lobby Congress for deregulation, and they managed to succeed in that in 2018, where they lobbied for deregulation, where they were able to now invest their securities in more riskier, in a way that is more riskier asset, where they are having a bit more flexibility on where they can invest their assets as well. And this is why they ended up investing in long-term securities instead of investing in short-term securities, because they were investing deposits as well. So because of this, it basically means that because their banks are having very low margins, because they are restricted on investing in high-risk assets as well, it basically means that a small loss from a particular credit asset can also have a very big impact on the overall book of returns of the bank as well, which means that it can also end up affecting the sustainability of the financial institution as well. Hence, the need for continuous credit risk analysis as well. Are there any questions before we move on to the seventh one? Any questions? The seventh reason is proliferation of limited liability entities. And I'll read from the beginning of the paragraph there. And they say, limited liability enterprises are among the creative inventions of mankind and emerged as a solution to expanding world trade in the mid-1800s. So unlike a proprietorship and general partnership, liability of the owners or shareholders of limited liability companies is limited to their original contribution of capital. So while this accelerated risk-taking, the new arrangement shifted the onerous burden to the creditors to ensure the creditworthiness of the business enterprise, separately from the shareholders, which means because you as a supplier of credit, you are not able to attach what the shareholder of the obligor owns privately as well, unless in very unique circumstances. It basically means that because that obligor is operating as a limited liability entity, the maximum that you're able to claim from the obligor is what the owners of the organization or of the obligor is have invested in as well. So because of this, it basically means that the burden on ensuring that the obligor perform there is no default from the obligor is now going to be on the supplier of credit as well. So because the burden is on the supplier of credit, basically means that this is the reason why the supplier of credit needs to do a credit risk analysis as well. The eighth reason is to do with risk and return matching. And here they say different levels of risk require varying returns. So as the credit risk increases, so should the returns in order to compensate for higher risks taken. So which means in this case, high risk, high expected return. So now, what we also need to make sure that we take note of as well is that when you look at risk and return matching as well, we need, the reason why we need to do a credit risk analysis as well is mainly because as a supplier of credit, remember, you are going to be able to assess and price the risk of the credit asset initially when the arrangement or when the contract is done as well, which basically means that because of that as well, this is the reason why we need to do a credit risk analysis, mainly because this also helps us with the credit pricing of the credit asset. Because remember, the credit pricing of the credit asset needs to take into account the risk. And because we need to take into account the risk, this is how we're going to be able to arrive at the price of the credit, which is basically the return that is going to be charged as well. That's why you see that when you look at pricing of the credit asset, we say your nominal rate of return is given as the real rate of return plus inflation premium plus risk premium. So which means your nominal rate of return is basically the credit price. So that's your credit price. So which means your real rate of return and inflation premium, this is usually the risk-free rate of return. So which basically means that to ensure that you arrive at a good credit price, which determines your return, it means that you need to make sure that you properly take into account the credit risk in this case. So one of the issues that you need to take into account here is the credit risk, because if you don't take into account credit risk properly there, it means that you are not going to be able to take into account, or you're not going to be able to properly price your credit asset, which means you're not able to match the return against the risk as well. Are there any questions? The eighth reason is disintermediation. And when you look at disintermediation, they say, with the expansion of secondary capital and debt markets, many credit-worthy customers, especially larger ones, access and raise funds directly from the public. So which means in this case, because they are going to be directly raising these funds directly from the public as well, it basically means that there is no intermediary who's going to be now doing the proper pricing of the credit assets as well. Hence, hence in this case, it basically means that this is what gives rise to the reason why there is going to be need for proper credit risk analysis. Because if without proper credit risk analysis, it basically means that you as the investor, you are now going to be having a situation where you are taking on a lot more risk for very little return. Because remember, at the end of the day, it goes back to the concept where we say you want to be able to maximize your return for a given level of risk. Which means that because you want to be able to maximize your return for a given level of risk, and because there's no intermediation between the supply of credit and the demand of credit as well, it basically means that if without proper credit risk analysis, there's going to be mispricing of the credit risk as well, which means that you're going to be having a situation where the supply of credit is not going to be going to be getting a lower return for a given level of risk as well. The other reason for credit risk analysis is to do with off-balance sheet transactions. And I'll read from the beginning of the paragraph there. And yet they say, as the business environment and nature of businesses become complicated, business people are in search of various risk-reducing, risk-transferring transactions. So derivatives are numerous shapes. Derivatives of numerous shapes and categories are being used by companies to control foreign exchange exposure, interest rate fluctuations, commodity price volatility, and so on. So usage of other off-balance sheet transactions, such as operating lease, factoring with recourse, discounting of bills, are not uncommon. And because of this, it basically means that credit risk analysis will help identify how much your true risk exposure would be. Because remember, because there's going to be use of derivatives as well, it basically means that this also helps you identify to say, okay, fine, if we take into account these different types of derivatives as well, how is it going to end up affecting the overall risk exposure as well? So it basically means that the use of derivatives as well ends up reducing the overall risk exposure of the supply of credit as well. But we're going to be looking at them later on, where we look at, for example, credit risk, credit default swaps as well, where we see exactly how can derivatives such as credit default swaps, how are they able to reduce the overall risk exposure of the supply of credit as well by going into a credit default swap arrangement, where they are now going to be transferring the risk of their credit assets from themselves, from their book, going on to the insurer in that case. So that's basically how we can also look at off-balance sheet transactions and how they can also end up affecting the credit risk exposure and of the organization as well through credit risk analysis. So are there any questions on the need for credit risk analysis? Are there any questions on the reasons why we need to conduct credit risk analysis? Any questions? On the next section, we look at section 2.7, which looks at challenges of credit risk analysis. We look at challenges of credit risk analysis. And the first one, they say the art and science of credit risk analysis. And under that, we look at the major challenges in credit risk analysis. And the first one that they give there is reliability of the data. And here they say, in order to conduct a credit risk study, analysts require a substantial amount of data and information related to the general economy, industry, and the borrower. So financial statements are one of the major sources of data. So usually, audited accounts are relied on heavily by banks, financial, and credit institutions. So they take comfort from the fact that the books of the accounts are audited by the financial experts. However, the collapse of several high-profile institutions just months after a clean report issued by their auditors casts a long shadow over audited accounts as well. So which means in this case, one of the issues that also comes about in conducting credit risk analysis as well is the reliability of data. So although preferably one would prefer to use audit financial statements, there is still issues with audit financial statement as well, as we have seen historically when you look at the fall of some of these big companies as well. The second one is profitability of business considerations. And I will read from the beginning of the paragraph. And they say, banks and financial institutions are also commercial establishments, and often profits are a key driving factor. So the management team is also usually incentivized to aim at higher profits that will result in bonuses for key executives and dividends for the shareholders. So sometimes the overriding focus on profitability blinds the decision on risk-taking with disastrous consequences. And this is very much of interest to us, especially when we go to the recent case of SVB Bank, where we saw that the executives made it, because they were pursuing profitability, they made a decision, or a conscious decision, to lobby for deregulation. And when they succeeded in that, they managed to invest their deposits in long-term securities. But at the same time, when we know that deposits, they are likely to be demanded any time by the depositors as well. So which means that if you invest deposits in long-term securities as well, it basically means that you are going to be, your risk, even if you invest in government securities as well, you are likely to be negatively affected if the depositor wants their money, and then you're going to be forced to sell those securities at a loss, like what we saw with SVB Bank. And we also saw the same as well when we look at from the South African case, where we look at VBS Bank as well, where we saw that the deposits, the municipal deposits were, I can't remember exactly where they were invested in, but it was basically invested in instruments where municipal handbook does not even allow them to invest in those type of securities as well, which basically means that they were taking on more risk than what was desired because of pursuit of profits as well. So basically means that, so one of the issues that you also come about when it comes to credit risk analysis, where you are finding that banks are always going to be caught in between the issues of regulation and profit maximization as well. Then the third one is unpredictable future. And here they say, the historical analysis of the borrower is done with an underlying assumption that the past track record provides a rough guide to the future. But what do we know? Generally, the past does not always predict the future. So we cannot always expect that whatever happened in the past is necessarily going to be what's going to happen in the future as well. So which basically means that one of the constraints of credit risk analysis is that the use of past data does not necessarily predict what is going to happen in the future as well. The fourth one is that reliability of risk models. And here they say the increasing use of credit risk models to measure risk and to price assets during the late 90s and the 2000s was heavily criticized after the 2008 global credit crisis. Often, the reliability of models decreases with complexity, and the assumption based in which the models are developed as well. So we see, like, for example, some of the models, they're not necessarily going to be reliable in trying to assess the risk exposure going into the future as well. Like what we saw, that the model used to predict the dot-com crash in 2001 could not have been used to predict the crash in the 2008, as variables were different, mainly because the dot-com crash was basically, the risk was basically emanating from what? From the tech industry. And then the 2008 crash was basically emanating from what? From the real estate industry as well. So which basically means that some of the models are not going to be able to reliably forecast or be able to use to predict and in making analysis when it comes to credit risk analysis as well. Are we on the same page when it comes to some of the issues that come about when it comes to credit risk analysis? Any questions?
Hi, Ranus.
Yes.
Quick one. Sorry to take you back to the first one. I think the reliability of data. So since financial institutions mainly relying on audited financial statements, is there an alternative? Like if let's say you are doing an analysis, maybe you are one of the business analysts, then you can sort of pick up that the T's are not crossing and the I's are not dotting. So is there any other alternative that you can use instead of using those specific sets of audited financial statements? Thank you.
This is where it becomes a bit tricky, hey? Because usually when you will see that later on when we do in the later chapters as well, that most of the analysis that we're going to be doing when we look at identifying business risk, and we also when we look at identifying financial risk as well, it's all based on analyzing the financial statements. So it's all based on that, which basically means that having other alternative sources would be very, very difficult. Yeah, it would be very, very difficult to say you can use other sources as sources of data as well when it comes to analyzing a particular company. Maybe what you can also use probably is where you can say, you can try to look at industry trends as well, where you can say, based on industry trends, where do we see this particular industry going to the future? And yeah, but it's usually when you look at historical analysis, the most reliable sources of data when it comes to historical analysis, basically analyzing the financial statements. So yes, what they're trying to put across here, remember they're saying major challenges, right? So they're basically acknowledging that when it comes to credit risk analysis, we are going to be using financial statements. But when you use these financial statements as well, take them with a pinch of salt, with an acknowledgement in the back of your mind that it's not all the time that, even though you are given that these financial statements are audited financial statements, it's not all the time that you're now going to be saying that this is the this is basically the it basically means that everything on that has been presented there is 100% true. We have seen that even if you look at the case in South Africa as well. Remember, we have had so many audit firms that also went into trouble. Recently, it was, what is that audit firm that had to get rid of the whole board? And I remember now they employed this, the CEO was now a lady that started, what is that, which audit firm? It's one of the big four in South Africa.
KPMG.
Yes, KPMG. Yes, it was KPMG, where we saw that. So it basically means that if big audit firms like KPMG can also be subject to such practices as well. Going into detail regarding that, I'm not going to worry. I'm not going to go into detail regarding that as well. But the bottom line is, they are basically saying that yes, we know that when you do or conduct a credit risk analysis, most of the time you are going to be having to use what? Financial statements, preferably audited financial statements, right? So you're going to be using financial statements, but preferably audited financial statements. But even when you use audited financial statements as well, you also need to keep at the back of your mind that it's not all the time that whatever is presented to you is 100% true. Because even if it's audited financial statements, you also have to take it with a pinch of salt, where you need to acknowledge that there might be, or a small percentage of what, where there's a small probability that what, not everything is as true as it is deemed to be as well. Although, when you look at credit risk analysis, most of the time, you are going to be relying more, when you look at the use of historical data, you're going to be relying more on financial statements in most cases. So it's an acknowledgement to say, when you're doing a credit risk analysis, you are going to be using the financial data. But when you use this financial data, you now need to preferably use audited financial data. So you always, your first point of call is always what? To prefer to use audited financial data. Although with audited financial data, you now have to keep at the back of your mind that it does not necessarily mean that whatever you're given there is 100% the true nature of the business as well. There is also some cases where you have to take into account all these other things that can also happen even to those financial statements as well. So these are, remember, they are basically talking about the challenges. So it's one of the issues that they are basically saying that you have to take into account when you do a credit risk analysis. Are we together there?
Yes, I'm covered. Thank you very much, Reinhold.
So they are acknowledging that when you do a credit risk analysis, you are going to be using financial data. But when you use this particular data, when you use this data as well, preferably use audited data, although you always have to keep it in the back of your mind that there's also historically been cases where even the auditor themselves have been found to be compromised. Can we move on? Are there any questions? Any other questions? All right. On section 2.8, we look at elements of credit risk analysis. And when you look at elements of credit risk analysis, I'm going to read from the beginning of the paragraph. And here they say, the aim of credit risk analysis is to find an answer to a question of whether a new credit is to be extended, or whether the current asset, the current set of credit facilities given a customer must be withdrawn. In all such questions, the following factors will be considered, either implicitly or explicitly. And these factors, we refer to them as the 5 C's of credit. Now, when it comes to the 5 C's of credit, please take note. They are also arranged in the form of, according to their importance as well. So the most important of the 5 C's of credit is basically the character, and the least important is the collateral. So they're basically arranged according to the level of importance as well. So please make sure that you take note of that. So when it comes to the 5 C's of credit, the first one is character, where they say this shows the integrity and honesty of the borrower to settle their dues on time. So which means it is pertinent to say that the history of credit has recorded several instances where the borrower had the capacity to repay, but not the willingness as well. So which means credit extended to a crook can be considered a credit loss from its very inception. So the most important of the 5 C's of credit is character. The second one is capital, where they say a prudent lender would ensure that the borrower has a sufficient stake in the business. Hence, the higher the capital contribution by the owners of the business, the better. So lenders need to ensure that a substantial interest of the entrepreneur is at stake should the business fail, so that they also, the entrepreneur or the owners of the business also have something to lose. If they have something to lose, they are going to be incentivized to actually ensure that the project or the company is also going to be doing well as well. The next one is capacity. And here they say, the borrower's capacity to meet their debt service obligations must be studied. So in the case of the business, in the case of business lending, this is done through the study of financial statement. That is financial analysis, including interpretation of financial ratios that indicates the borrower's ability to repay. So since the business is influenced by the wider economy, the study of the economic conditions is also necessary to assess the capacity to pay as well. So this is where we look at the economic cycles, where we say when the economy is going through the expansionary phase, the capacity to pay is generally higher. But when the economy goes through the contractionary phase, the capacity to pay becomes lower as well. The fourth one looks at conditions. And here they say, these conditions cover the terms and covenants included in the loan or credit facilities agreements. So the lender must ensure that the loan agreement clauses are legally enforceable. So which means that if there's going to be any conditions that are going to be put in place on the loan agreement, if there's going to be any covenants that are going to be put in place when it comes to the loan agreement as well, there has to be, these agreements have to be, these conditions have to be legally enforceable as well, so that they're able to recover their funds as well in case of default. Then there is also the issue of collateral. And here they say, collateral means the assets offered by the borrower to secure the credit. So while this collateral is a prominent part of the 5 Cs, it is to be noted that most of the high quality credit-worthy customers, for instance, AAA credit corporate, need not to extend collateral in most cases. So often, AAA companies obtain credit with negligible terms and conditions. So similarly, in a non-recourse project credit or factoring, the suppliers of credit cannot insist upon any collateral at all. So it is a rule of thumb in credit that the credit must be able to stand on its own with the support of the support of any collateral. So the collateral is just an additional comfort. So please take note of the 5 Cs of credit. I've seen this being brought in as a theory question in the exam. So this has been brought in previously as a theory question in the exam. I think, if I still remember correctly, it was one of the papers where it was carrying about 10. Yeah, I think it was carrying about 10 marks in the exam as well. So please make sure that you take note of the 5 Cs of credit. So is there any question regarding the 5 Cs of credit? Any questions? So from chapter 2, can you look at question 3 and question 6 of the chapter? So can you, under practice questions or exercise questions, as your homework, can you look at question 3 and question 6? So as your homework, can you look at question 3 and question 6 of chapter 2? Remember what I said? After we finish the first 10 chapters of the textbook, what we're going to do is that we're going to dedicate a class where we're going to be going over these homework questions together in class. So please ensure that you do these homework questions on your own before we get to end of chapter 10. Because after we finish chapter 10, I'm going to give you, I'm going to say, we're going to dedicate a class, and on that particular class, we're going to be reviewing things that we've done from chapters 1 to chapter 10, as well as I'll be picking certain questions from certain chapters as homework questions as well. So please take note of this. Very, very important.
Rhinos, what is your selection criteria? Why do you opt to choose only those 2 out of 8?
It's just a random questions on what I see as maybe likely questions that might be that are likely to come as well. There's no particular criteria, because with the time limitations, we won't be able to do all the questions or all the questions at the back of each chapter as well. So because of the time limitation, I'm just picking questions that I'm saying maybe these ones can potentially come as theory questions in the exam, but there's no particular criteria on the choice. Are there any other questions? So as homework questions of chapter 2, can you look at question 3 and 6 of the chapter? So can you look at question 2 and 6? Are there any questions on what we've covered so far? All right, so what we'll do is by Monday, during the course of the day, I'll also share the link to the classes that we did today as well. So by Monday, during the course of the day, I'll also share the link to the chapters that we've covered today. Also, can you please go over and create a user account on the website? And when you create the user account on the website, can you also indicate to me which modules you want to be linked via WhatsApp as well? You indicate to me your WhatsApp, your email address on the WhatsApp, and you indicate which modules you want me to create to link for you on the website as well, so that you're able to have free. Remember, between now until end of until the 31st of March, we're giving free access to our website where you are able to go over the videos, you're able to access the textbook, you're able to access a lot of material on our website as well. So for you to be able to do that, can you please go onto our website and create a user account? And when you do that, send me a direct message indicating your email address and the modules that you want me to link for you, so that I'm able to link for you those modules, so that in advance, as we prepare for the coming classes as well, you are able to go through the material in advance. Because I think on the website for Rsk4804, we have made available the first 5 chapters of the textbook. So which means that in preparation for the coming chapters as well, please ensure that you're able to access the videos there. Remember, between now and until the 31st of March, access to our website is free, but please ensure that by the 31st of March, you're also officially registered with us, because after the 31st of March, if you're not officially registered with us, we temporarily suspend your access. Then those who are officially registered with us, they are going to be able to continue accessing, and we're able to open up more videos and material as well as we go. All right, if there are no questions, enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Can I confirm your website?
I'll share